I want to tell you about Margaret. Margaret Chen, 74 years old, living alone in apartment 3B of a quiet building in Portland, Oregon. And I want to tell you about the Thanksgiving invitation that changed her life in ways she never could have imagined. But first, let me tell you about loneliness. Real loneliness. The kind that settles into your bones when you've outlived your spouse. When your children live 2,000 miles away with their own busy lives. When holidays become just another day, circled on a calendar that nobody else is looking at. Margaret knew that loneliness well. November 20. Margaret had been a widow for 8 years. Her husband David passed in 2016, and honestly, a part of her went with him. They'd been married for 49 years. 49 beautiful, ordinary, precious years. Her daughter Amy lived in Boston with 3 kids. Her son Kevin was in Seattle with his career in tech. They called on Sundays. Mostly. Sometimes they remembered. Life was busy for them, and Margaret understood that. She really did. For the past 8 Thanksgivings, Margaret had spent the day alone. She'd cook a small chicken breast, maybe some mashed potatoes, watch the parade on television, and pretend it didn't hurt. But this year, something was different. This year, she'd noticed her neighbor across the hall, apartment 3A, an elderly man named Walter. Walter Humphrey, 82 years old, walked with a cane. Barely ever left his apartment. Margaret would see him sometimes, shuffling to get his mail. He never made eye contact. Never said more than a brief nod. But she noticed something else too. She noticed that his mailbox was always full. That no one ever visited. That she'd hear his television playing the same news channel, hour after hour, day after day, through the thin walls. She recognized that loneliness. Because she lived it too. 3 days before Thanksgiving, Margaret made a decision. A small decision that felt terrifying in the moment. She baked an extra apple pie. Her specialty, David's favorite recipe. And she walked across the hall and knocked on Walter's door. It took almost 2 minutes for him to answer. She could hear the shuffle of his cane, the slow unlocking of multiple locks. When the door finally opened, Walter looked at her with suspicion and confusion. "Yes," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Hello, Mr. Humphrey," Margaret said, suddenly feeling foolish. "I'm Margaret, from 3B. We've been neighbors for how long has it been now?" "For years," Walter said flatly. "What do you want?" Margaret nearly turned around right then. But she didn't. "I baked too much pie," she lied gently. "I was wondering if you'd like one. Apple. Homemade." Walter stared at the pie, then at her face, then back at the pie. "Why?" he asked. "Because," Margaret said honestly, "I think we're both going to be alone on Thanksgiving, and I thought, maybe we don't have to be." Walter didn't answer right away. He just stood there, holding his cane. This frail old man with watery eyes and a weathered face. "I'm inviting you to Thanksgiving dinner," Margaret continued, her courage building. "Thursday, 2 o'clock. Nothing fancy. Just turkey and the usual things. And company. Human company." "I don't do charity," Walter said stiffly. "Good," Margaret replied. "Because I'm not offering charity. I'm offering friendship. There's a difference." Walter's jaw tightened. For a moment, Margaret thought he might slam the door in her face. Instead, he said quietly, "What should I bring?" Margaret smiled. "Just yourself. That's more than enough." Thanksgiving Day arrived. Margaret cooked more food than 2 people could possibly eat. A 12-pound turkey, stuffing, green bean casserole, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, rolls, and 3 pies. At exactly 2 o'clock, Walter knocked on her door. He'd dressed up a clean button-down shirt, pressed slacks, even cologne. His hair was combed neatly. He held a bottle of wine that was probably older than Margaret's daughter. "I know you said just myself," Walter said awkwardly. "But this seemed ... appropriate." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. "Come in, Walter, please." They ate slowly. They talked even more slowly. Decades of loneliness don't disappear over one meal, but they started to crack. Walter told her about his wife, Helen, who'd passed 12 years ago. About his son Christopher, who died in Afghanistan in 2005. About how he declosed himself off after that, because the pain of connection seemed worse than the numbness of isolation. Margaret told him about David. About how every morning she still woke up and reached for his side of the bed. About how her kids meant well, but had their own lives, and she didn't want to be a burden. "You're not a burden," Walter said firmly. "You're a human being who deserves connection. We all are." It was the most honest conversation Margaret had had in 8 years. As the evening ended and Walter prepared to leave, He paused at the door. "Thank you," he said, and his voice cracked. "I didn't realize how much I needed this. How much I needed to remember that I'm still alive." "Same time next week?" Margaret asked hopefully. "Maybe just coffee and cards." Walter smiled. Actually smiled. "I'd like that very much." And that's exactly what they did. Every Sunday afternoon, Margaret and Walter played cards. Gin, rummy, mostly. They'd drink coffee, eat whatever Margaret had baked, and talk about everything and nothing. Walter started leaving his apartment more. He'd knock on Margaret's door and ask if she needed anything from the store. She'd bake extra and bring him dinner twice a week. They became friends. Real friends. The kind of friendship that proves it's never too late to connect, never too late to matter to someone. 3 months later, February 14th, 2025, Valentine's Day. Margaret knocked on Walter's door for their usual Sunday card game. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. She tried the doorknob. It was unlocked, which wasn't like Walter at all. "Walter," she called out, stepping inside carefully. She found him in his armchair, facing the window, the morning newspaper still in his lap. He looked peaceful, like he'd simply fallen asleep watching the birds at the feeder outside. But he hadn't fallen asleep. Margaret called 911, but she already knew. Walter was gone. She cried for 3 days. Not the dramatic sobbing of sudden grief, but the quiet, steady tears of losing someone who'd become important. Someone who'd reminded her that friendship could bloom even in the winter of life. The funeral was small. Margaret was shocked to learn that Walter had been quite wealthy. He'd owned a successful manufacturing business before retiring, but he'd lived simply, modestly, alone. A lawyer approached Margaret after the service. "Mrs. Chen," he asked. "I'm Richard Pearson, Mr. Humphrey's attorney. I need to schedule a meeting with you regarding his will." Margaret was confused. "I think there's been a mistake. I was just his neighbor." "No mistake," the lawyer assured her. "You're specifically named. Can you come to my office tomorrow?" The next day, Margaret sat nervously in the lawyer's office. He opened a folder and pulled out Walter's last will and testament. Mr. Humphrey updated his will on January 15th of this year. The lawyer began. "Just 6 weeks after your Thanksgiving dinner together." He began to read. "To Margaret Chen, apartment 3B, who knocked on my door when no one else did. Who invited me to Thanksgiving when I'd forgotten what it felt like to be wanted. Who played cards with me every Sunday and reminded me that I was still a human being worth knowing." Margaret's hands trembled. The lawyer continued. "I leave to Margaret Chen the following. My entire estate, valued at approximately $4.2 million. My home in Bend, Oregon. My investment portfolio. And most importantly, my deepest gratitude." Margaret couldn't breathe. 4 million. "There's more," the lawyer said, pulling out a handwritten letter. He handed it to Margaret. It was Walter's handwriting, shaky but clear. "Dear Margaret, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I hope I went peacefully, because these last 3 months with you have given me more peace than I've had in 15 years. I need you to understand something. I wasn't just lonely. I was ready to give up. The morning before Thanksgiving, I'd written a note. I'd made a plan. I couldn't see the point of continuing. Then you knocked on my door with a pie and an invitation. You saved my life, Margaret. Not dramatically, not heroically, but in the way that really matters. You reminded me that I mattered, that someone would notice if I wasn't there. That connection was still possible. You gave me 3 more months of life that actually felt like living. This money has been sitting in banks, doing nothing, meaning nothing. My son is gone. I have no other family. The money was just numbers on paper. But you gave me something priceless. You gave me friendship when I'd forgotten what that word even meant. So please, take this money and do something beautiful with it. Travel. Help your kids. Donate to causes you believe in. But mostly, please keep doing what you do. Keep knocking on doors. Keep inviting lonely people to dinner. Keep being the kind of human being who makes life worth living for others. You told me that Thanksgiving that we didn't have to be alone. You were right. Thank you for those 3 months. They were the best ending to my life I could have asked for. Your friend always, Walter." Margaret couldn't see the letter anymore through her tears. The lawyer waited patiently, then said gently, "He also left instructions. He wants you to use some of the money to start a foundation, a program that connects isolated elderly people with companions." He'd already drafted the mission statement and set aside $200,000 specifically for that. Margaret looked up. "He did?" He called it the Thanksgiving Connection Project. He said you'd know what to do with it. 6 months later, Margaret stood in a community center in Portland. Around her were 25 volunteer companions and 25 isolated seniors who'd been matched through Walter's foundation. They were having their first group dinner together. Margaret watched as strangers became friends over shared meals, as laughter filled rooms that had been silent, as people who'd been invisible suddenly mattered to someone. Her daughter, Amy, had moved back to Portland to help run the foundation. Her son, Kevin, had quit his tech job to manage the program. The family was together again, united by purpose. And every Thanksgiving, the foundation hosted a massive dinner. Hundreds of people, who would have been alone now, shared tables together. On the wall was a plaque. It had Walter's photo and a simple quote from his letter: "Keep knocking on doors. Keep inviting lonely people to dinner." You know, I think about Margaret's story often, because here's the thing. She didn't invite Walter to Thanksgiving, expecting anything in return. She wasn't hoping for an inheritance. She wasn't looking for recognition or reward. She just saw another lonely human being and thought, maybe we don't have to be alone. That's it, that simple, that profound. And Walter didn't leave her his fortune because she'd been kind once. He left it to her because her kindness gave him 3 more months of life that felt worth living. Because she reminded him, at 82 years old, that he still mattered, that he was still seen, that he was still human. $4.2 million. That's what the world valued Walter's estate at. But 3 months of friendship, of Sunday card games, of someone caring whether he woke up in the morning. That was priceless. That was everything. As we head into this holiday season, I want you to think about something. Who's the Walter in your life? Who's the neighbor you pass but never really see? Who's the person at church who always sits alone? Who's the elderly relative everyone's too busy to visit? Who's living in apartment 3A while you're in apartment 3B, separated by just a thin wall and an enormous chasm of loneliness? Margaret knocked on that door with just a pie and an invitation. That's all it took. A pie and an invitation. You don't need $4 million to change someone's life. You don't need grand gestures or elaborate plans. Sometimes you just need to knock on a door and say, you don't have to be alone. And you know what? Neither do you. Because loneliness is an epidemic in our world today, especially among older adults, especially during the holidays. But it doesn't have to be. It really doesn't. Walter and Margaret proved that. They proved that it's never too late to connect. Never too late to matter. Never too late to transform each other's lives with something as simple as showing up. So here's my challenge to you this week. Find your Walter. Knock on their door. Invite them to coffee, to dinner, to a card game, to anything. And if you're feeling like Walter, isolated and invisible, please know this: you matter, your life has value. And somewhere, there's a Margaret who's hoping for the courage to knock on your door. Let them, please, let them in. Because that knock on the door might save your life, and your answer might save theirs. Thank you for listening to Walter and Margaret's story. If this touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories that remind us why connection matters, why kindness matters, why we all matter. Until next time, be brave enough to knock on the door, and be brave enough to open it. God bless you. Happy Thanksgiving. And remember, you don't have to be alone. This is a story of triumph. Did the protagonist make the right decisions? If you were in this situation, what would you do? Share your opinion in the comments. We want to know what you think. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Memorable Stories and Overcoming, where inspiring stories of triumph and justice are shared daily.